Just to start, I'd love to introduce myself. My name is Wes Moon. I'm a founder of Wisely, a fundraising accelerator program. We can help you build and grow your fundraising portfolios, identify your best unassigned prospects, and give intelligence to your gift officers about when and how much they should be connecting with their prospects with. Today, I'm joined by Mark Jordan. Mark, why don't you take an opportunity to say hello?
Great to be here. Thanks, Wes. Looking forward to the discussion today.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to read Mark's bio. Mark and I go back a little ways. And as I read his bio in preparation for this, I was astounded at all the things he's done. So Mark is currently the managing director at Tiptap Foundation. It's the charitable giving arm of Tiptap, a touchless donations and touchless payments solution provider. Mark is a marketing and communications leader with over 25 years of brand building experience in the agency, corporate, and nonprofit space. Prior to joining the Tiptap Foundation, Mark was the VP of Brand Strategy and Chief Communications Officer at Kids Help Phone, where he led the team responsible for the overall brand strategy, as well as the marketing and communications for that organization. Mark was also a director on the brand strategy and communications team at Thick Kids Foundation, where he co-led the launch and rollout of the award-winning and globally recognized Versus brand campaign. Mark teaches digital media marketing at George Brown College and digital strategy and marketing management at U of T's School of Continuing Studies. Mark, that's an impressive bio.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
Fantastic. So we've introduced Mark. There's a couple of things that I want to do just as we get started. Make sure we've all been living on Zoom and other video and chat platforms, but just to make sure we know what we're doing here today, I would love to see some people raise their hand. You'll see this typically at the bottom of your screen. And I'm looking for some hand raisers. Oh, I got a couple. Alex, Alexander, Kim, Jay, Sasmita, fantastic. Greg, so we now know how to raise your hand. If you have something that you want to draw our attention to, you can raise your hand. Alternatively, if you had something very specific, a question perhaps from Mark or I, that would be either in the moment or for a reserved time at the end for a Q&A, you could do that by adding in a question in the Q&A. And I would love to see who can post the first question into Q&A. So just like raising your hand, it'll be on the bar at the bottom. Jay, how am I? I'm fantastic. It's summer. I have a vacation coming up. I'm about to talk to Mark about digital transformation in the nonprofit sector. I couldn't be more excited. Thank you. So we've now answered that question, so we can take care of that. Done. Okay. So what we're going to take care of now is we've done our housekeeping. We've introduced Mark. You know who I am. Mark, why don't you tell us how you got into nonprofit?
For sure. So for me, it's interesting. Looking back, it's always when you reflect on something that you realize your journey. I would say working and giving back has always been a part of who I am. Even agency side, I think what resonated most for me in the first chapter of my career, which is agency side, is working on programs and clients where there was an altruistic or a giving back component. So for example, I had the opportunity and very grateful to have worked on the Dove campaign for Real Beauty as an example. And I reached a point where I kind of looked backwards and I was like, how do I do more of that, but just all the time? So my pivot into the not-for-profit world was really with Sick Kids. And I actually volunteered on an advisory board there. Early days of their digital, what would be called their digital transformation work, back in 2009, I think it would have been. So that was kind of my opportunity to learn a bit more about the organization, to meet some people, to network. And then 2 years later, up popped this role on what was the communications team at the time. And it was one of those moments where, too good to be true. I knew I needed to throw my hat in the ring, but I went into that with, very limited client side experience, agency experience working with not-for-profits. And I thought, I'm on my back foot here, making that shift. The reality was, we can talk a little bit about this as we talk about digital transformation. The skills I had and the background I had was exactly what the organization was looking for at the time, at that chapter in their journey, because they were looking for different perspectives and different backgrounds, not just someone who sort of worked in the not-for-profit space for 20 years, and this is the fourth organization or fifth organization they've worked for. So that was really my step into the not-for-profit space, where I've been for the better part of a decade now. If I look backwards, it's kind of like my journey has led me to here, and there's a reason why all those steps along the way kind of led to where I am today.
That's very interesting to me, Mark. Most often we hear people who get into nonprofit more by accident than on purpose, and you had a very strategic approach to moving into our space as it exists today. Uh, One thing I'd love you to expand on a little bit. Not all our listeners here are going to be in the Toronto area, and certainly not all of them are in Canada. Why don't you talk a little bit about Sick Kids, just briefly, and maybe that Versus campaign that kind of turned our sector, certainly in Toronto, on its heels?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a platform that really has been held up globally as an example for how not-for-profits can think about shifting the perspective. And I will say, when I started, we were very much a team that was communications focused, with a little bit of brand strategy and digital on the side. And by the time I left Sick Kids, the equation had completely flipped to be a strategic, brand focused team that also did communications. And in that journey, there were many stepping stones to Versus. Ultimately, Versus was meant to be a shift to jolt people off the sidelines. So Sick Kids on a great trajectory revenue wise, you'd look at the impact report year over year and say, why are you making any changes? And you're on a constant trajectory upwards. And the reality was, organization looked forward to where they needed to be, and they're now in the latter part of a 1.5, was 1.3, but now $1.5 billion campaign, realized that trajectory was not going to get them where they needed to go. So it meant looking at things differently. And the shift that was ultimately made on the brand side was thinking less about the organization as a charity, a traditional charity, and more like a performance brand. If you think about a hospital, the analogy of players on the field, those are the doctors, the researchers, the people at the bedside taking care of the kids. So it was really a shift that then was meant to bring in new supporters, donors, as well as set the stage for what is now, a transformation of the campus here in downtown Toronto.
Well, congratulations on all your work there, Mark. And one of the things that I really like about your story is that you had worked on big for-profit campaigns, the Dove Real Beauty, and transitioned that into the nonprofit, where there was more of a focus on that brand, but also go to market on digital. So we're going to dig into that a little bit later. And we were talking at Sick Kids, a $1.5 billion campaign. So it's audacious fundraising goal that is achieved by this wonderful organization in Toronto. So, Mark, one of the things that I like about you is that we kind of first met because I noticed something that your daughters were doing. And Mark and I live in neighboring communities. Mark, why don't you tell me a little bit about the work that your kids did? starting 5, 6, maybe 10 years ago at this point.
Yeah, it's almost 12 years, over 12 years now. So sort of at the other end of the spectrum, if you will, very much a grassroots campaign that was started originally by our oldest daughter, then really became a family passion project, raising food and funds for the Daily Bread Food Bank here in Toronto. And it literally started as a street level campaign, posters printed off at the local Staples, handed out on the street, and evolved over better part of a decade to become one of the largest community-based fundraisers for Daily Bread. So over 500,000 pounds of food raised in those 10 years. And I think what that taught me, and it kind of, as we talk about the spectrum of, it's great to talk about like a Sick Kids or some of the other sort of bigger gorillas out there in the space, it also taught me about, you know, operating at a community-based level with zero marketing dollars, $0 period, and how to be scrappy, how to work with the community, how to work with people in your neighborhood to still achieve, you know, a fairly significant goal, and also bring others along on the journey. So we can talk a little bit about that as we talk about sort of the range of not-for-profits, because we think about the Sick Kids, we think about the Princess Margarets, but the reality is the vast majority of not-for-profits, and I'm talking about in Canada again, for those who are joining outside Canada, are actually under $500,000 in annual fundraising and are run mostly by volunteers. So that's part of the challenge when it comes to digital transformation and the topic we're talking about today.
Yeah, really excited about that. You know, Dave, sorry, yeah, we do have a little bit of background noise. Unfortunately, here in Toronto, we still have lockdowns and no offices. So we are still working from home. I apologize for anything that you see there, or technically hear there, but I do appreciate the feedback. So Mark, I think I really want to then dig in just for a minute or two on TipTap. You were telling me a story about TipTap that I want to hear, but before we do that, what is TipTap?
So yeah, simply put as possible, we are a touchless payments and a touchless giving solution. Literally a device, standalone, it's about the size of half a deck of cards, completely autonomous in the sense that you don't need anything other than a power source to run it. You literally can put these out in the field with volunteers, at corporate partners and retailers, in malls, and collect touchless donations. And the reality is, you know, cash is disappearing. It has been for a while, and it was only accelerated by the last 16, 17 months. So what we provide is really a solution that does a few things. It drives fundraising for the not-for-profits we work with. It frees up time, because some of that time would have been spent on trying to raise funds, that you can now direct some of that time to other areas of the business, whether it's, you know, major gifts and things like that. And it generates data. So insights on your donors, where they're donating, how they're donating, which you can correlate with some of the other things you're doing in the organization. So our focus, we're a purpose-driven organization, truly. Our founder, Chris Greenfield, actually started the company with helping others as the core. So we're really focused right now on the not-for-profit and charitable space, because it's one of the areas that has been hit the hardest, certainly over the last 16, 17 months, but also by this disappearance of cash, which is a real trend. And I think it's projected to, 90% of transactions in 2021 are going to be digital and not physical. So that's TipTap.
Perfect. And the thing that we're about to talk to each other about is this digital transformation. And one really good example that we shared, and this is perhaps a good example of digital transformation. There was a fundraiser being run by the firefighters that stopped being able to collect cash and started using TipTap in an inventive way. Can you tell me about it?
Yeah, so during the month of June here in Toronto, typically the firefighters raise funds for a number of different charities, and they would normally go around with their boots. That's how they actually collect. That's a symbol, you know, if you're at a parade, firefighters are walking around collecting donations. So obviously not possible. What we did for them was actually create a unique tip-tap stand that they could use at one of their fire halls. The funds are being raised for YMCA Sprott House here, which is an LGBTQ Two-Spirit plus transition house. So the boot was, you know, rainbow colors, set up with a stand next to a fire truck in a really prominent location down on the waterfront. And they generated a ton of not only donations, but also conversation. We had, you know, Mayor Tory coming by and tapping, and yeah, so it was a real success from their standpoint, and allowed them again to move into still doing their fundraising, obviously not able to do it in person the way they had, but shifting to another way of looking at it.
And I think that's part of the crux of digital transformation. It's not just digitization, but it's looking at how you're tackling this. What do you think? Like, you could you define digital transformation for us?
Yeah, I think when we talk about digital transformation, we're talking about really a spectrum of ultimately what's digital maturity, I would say. So at one end of the spectrum, you have, I would classify it more like digitization. You know, you're taking a program, you're taking an initiative, and you're making it digital. Tends to be, you know, point solutions, or you're addressing that one thing. At the very end of the spectrum, when you look at something like digital transformation, you're really talking about looking top to bottom across the organization. Every program you run, every process, how you train and educate staff, your culture. It's truly like you're putting everything out on the table and looking at it through the lens of digital. And that, A, it takes time. That's not something that happens overnight. And B, the one thing in that I would say is most important, and we can talk about this a little bit more, is the culture piece. You know, we quickly jump to the technology piece, which is an important factor, but ultimately technology needs to be adopted and used, and culturally the organization needs to be set up for that innovation and transformation over time.
Would you say, Mark, that culture is the most important point that you have to get right in order to be successful?
I would put it right up there, if not the most important thing. It's in the top for sure, because we typically, you know, we jump to an early, you know, earlier days, we would go, you know, to the IT team for anything related to digital, because it was technology, you know, didn't necessarily understand it. The IT team will figure this out. This is really complex. The reality is that, you know, I think the pendulum has shifted significantly, and the roles that are involved in digital transformation, or should be more involved in digital transformation, are really those that are on the front lines of understanding the donor, understanding the audience, understanding the cultural context of how you're operating. That tends to be, you know, more teams like your sales team, or your fundraising team in the case of not-for-profit, or your marketing and communications team. So I think absolutely setting an organization up culturally to allow for that is critical, and often overlooked, because we think digital transformation, it's the technology. Technology is the enabler at the end of the day. And there are other things that are more important to make sure it succeeds.
I suppose you could always lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Is that the concept we're playing with here?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's also, you know, we talk about technology adoption, talk about innovation, right? Some of those things, you need to have a culture that's willing to accept trying new things, adapting. Innovation is messy, right? By nature, it's not a home run every time you try something new. And that's okay. That's how you're learning as an organization. That's how you're, you know, adapting and changing along the way. But that requires a culture to permit that. And, you know, when we talk about some of the things, challenges, there's always the opportunity side as well. When we talk about challenges in the not-for-profit sector, I think there are some things that have traditionally hampered that kind of innovation and trying new things.
When you talk about some of the challenges around innovation, and we got a question coming in from John and Adam, and I think Adam, I'm going to take your question at the end. John, now is actually a great time to answer your question. Uh, before we sort of leave this culture piece and maybe some of the challenges around getting that culture right, what steps have you seen, Mark, be successful in supporting um, an organization adopting to new technology innovation? So what are like some of those key things that you've seen some successful people do?
Definitely. I think it starts with organizational understanding at the very top that this is a priority. And I don't mean just knowing that the words digital transformation are important, like truly understanding what that means for the organization. Another key factor, I think, is really involving the organization. So where I've seen digital transformation or digital initiatives fall flat or not accomplish as much as they could have is when, again, it's like over to that one team, they're kind of tinkering in the corner, they're going to solve it for us and come back with a solution. Where I've seen greater success is where you involve, again, a cross section of the organization, both from a perspective, like getting different perspectives, but also from a buy-in. So it's not kind of like, here's the change, now just adopt it, right? They've been along for the journey and they've actually contributed to that change and contributed to that journey along the way. So those are two critical factors, I would say. And then back to the culture piece, it's really that ability and comfort level for people to try new things and ideas coming from different places, and the fact that not all of these ideas are going to work, and that's okay. It's placing those, call it the safe bets or the risks that you're willing to take to learn from and adapt. Because again, if everything you're trying you think is going to be a home run, then you're probably not pushing, or is a home run, I would say, you're probably not pushing hard enough if you're not failing.
Yeah, and in the tech startup space, it's important to actually fail and learn quickly. But there is one thing that I want to just maybe affirm. What I heard from you, Mark, is you get buy-in, top and bottom. So the more buy-in, the more people who identify with the challenge and the opportunity, the more likely any type of innovation, digital or not, it's likely to succeed. Did I hear that right?
I think that's fair. It is exactly that. It's not just sort of a top down, here's what we're doing, get it done. It's the bottom up, bubbling up of the ideas, the buy-in, the team that's actually going to be working on the transformation. Absolutely. It's both of those things kind of coming together in the middle, if you will.
And when you're, Greg, I'm going to answer your question here, I think. I'm going to ask it in a slightly different way. But when you're trying to create this buy-in, top and bottom, we have a challenge, we have an opportunity, we have the means to fix it. Sometimes that's going to be at odds with the resources going towards fundraising. How have you in the past, or how have organizations that you've worked with in the past worked around that challenge?
Yeah, well, this is where the maturity kind of spectrum comes in, I would say, starting with programs and looking at digitizing it. So I'll use a practical example. At Sick Kids, almost, I'm going to say 6 years ago, it might be longer than that. They actually launched a virtual, or I should say the former we launched a virtual event called the Great Cycle Challenge. Now, at the time, the purpose was to draw in new donors and participants, and also remove geography, because it's literally a virtual event. You can do it anywhere. Early days, we were finding people out in Saskatchewan were some of our top fundraisers, nowhere near the hospital in Toronto. That foresight, and certainly none of us would have predicted what we just went through, has actually set that event up for tremendous success. I think they're sitting at $2.6 million already raised, and the event doesn't start until August 1st. So I guess having those digitization of projects or programs is kind of the starting point. And then really the next stage in maturity, or the next wave, is starting to really connect those things together. So we went through probably 3 waves during my time at SickKids. And that last wave was really looking at the macro picture, connecting everything together. Everything from looking at the CRM platforms we were using, e-commerce, really looking at it from more of a systems, and again, that interconnectedness of everything we're doing. But I think it starts with, digitization, which is really what that Great Camp, or not Great, Great Cycle Challenge, event illustrates.
And just a follow-up question on that, can you actually be successful doing this off the side of your desk?
Well, to a point. I think at some point you need to invest in resources, which is again a challenge for the majority of not-for-profits out there, or find creative ways to accelerate the work you're doing. And one of those, opportunities is really to work with companies, organizations who are already there. Like, they're already at the front line of innovation. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's more working with them, and the startup and tech space is a great example of that. At SickKids, we had a program called Tech for SickKids, still running, which was meant to tap into the tech and innovation community, not just for donations, but also for unique ways to use platforms. So, the hospital ran a AI-based ER tool on a pilot to look at, projecting number of people that need to be in the ER based on any number of factors, time of year, the day, all sorts of things. On the foundation side, we worked with a number of startups to spin up everything from advocacy programs to other things. So I guess my point is, you don't need to retread that territory as a not-for-profit. I think more and more what we're seeing is partnerships and working together with others who are already, they're there, and how do you work with them to now kind of close the gap? Because the challenge is things aren't slowing down. If anything, they're continuing to accelerate. So we look at what happened over the last 17 months. It's only going to continue to accelerate. So not-for-profits, they need to catch up, and then they also need to keep running at the pace that change continues to happen, because it's not stopping.
Yeah, I remember I worked at the University of Toronto in their advancement team. And for those of you in Texas, I like to call that the big U of T. And we had a saying, I think it was we sort of adopted this phrase in 2001, when FedEx was able to tell you where your package was anywhere in the world at any given moment. We were starting to get feedback from our donors that they wanted some kind of that information to be, what's happening with my money and my transaction. And it helped shape the system that we were building there. But I imagine, Mark, things are very different today when we're all using our phones. What are donors expecting as a part of that, um, call it table stakes for on that digital side?
Yeah, it's interesting because we look at donors through the lens of our organization or through the lens of other not-for-profits at times. Reality is, donors don't look at us that way. They're looking at the world through their world and their eyes, and the world is, the expectations are all the things that are happening in the for-profit world and other organizations around them. Whether it's Amazon or Netflix or other organizations that are leading the digital charge and setting those expectations, that's the bar. It's not what's happening in the not-for-profit world necessarily. So that's the challenge, right? The not-for-profits have is, the expectation is, I go to Netflix and it's recommending for me based on all my, past viewing history, but then I come to your site or I come to your experience and you're asking me 10 times for my information, right? As just a simple example of that. I think the expectation is being set by the world in which we live in, not the not-for-profit world that not-for-profits live in.
So we, as general consumers, then know what the expectation is, because we live it with our everyday purchases and products that we're doing online. Um, I think this is an important point to touch on, Mark, is how does a smaller charity start to try to live up to those expectations?
Yeah, because for sure that can seem daunting, especially if you're at the earlier stage of digital maturity. But I think first of all, not about doing everything all at once, not possible. I think about the SickKids digital transformation journey, better part of a decade, and they're still working on, right? They're not done, they're not finished. So the one thing I would say is not to try and do it all at once. To prioritize it should always be through the lens of the business priorities. That's the other thing, is we tend to jump to solutions instead of really looking at, like, back to the SickKids example. The reason that change happened, massive brand shift and all the things that went along with it, was because of a business realization. We're not going to be able to hit the goals that we need to hit in like 3 to 5 years. We need to change significantly. The other thing I would say is there's resources out there, and this is, again, if you're a volunteer-based organization, resources are at a premium, but you can lean on organizations. We're working right now at Tiptap Foundation, for example, with an organization called 10,000 Hours. They're a group of volunteers in the tech space. They're working at companies ranging from Shopify, Twitter. Like, they are in the space and able to help other organizations from a resourcing standpoint and also from a knowledge standpoint, because they're living it. And in many ways, they are on the front lines. So I guess it would be, getting creative around how to solve some of those problems, but you're not going to be able to do everything all at once. You're going to have to tackle, the things that are going to impact your business the most, and lean on others to help you with that.
Yeah, and as I'm listening to you talk here, Mark, I'm starting to get a little bit of a parallel between the stores on Main Street, who basically went from zero digital to full digital as quickly as they could through the pandemic, and having established market leaders like Amazon make it very convenient for you to buy something and it shows up at your house. Is that, like, are we seeing the same challenge here for the charities that haven't gone through that digital adoption phase?
I think there are some parallels, right? And there you had programs like Digital Main Street, you know, restaurants and others, organizations looking to things like Shopify to enable if they've never had e-commerce capabilities. So again, there are resources and tools out there, and it's really about, like I said before, like looking at where your business priority lies and where you can have the most impact. Sometimes I see parallels too between digital transformation and brand. You know, we look at brand and we say, why are we investing in brand? We need sales tomorrow. We need more donations tomorrow. So that's where we put our time and our effort. The reality is it's about doing both of those things at the same time, right? Focused on the things that you have to do that are right in front of you. And in parallel, you need to be looking at some of these longer term brand, digital, and doing them at the same in parallel, because ultimately they'll get you where you need to go in the future, and they'll start to lift what you're doing on a month by month, quarter by quarter basis.
Am I hearing in a way that we should be this, and this is has to do with our websites? Is our website now like how we are viewed by our constituents, donors, and so on?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it is a one touch point, I would say, that is critical. It's also an owned touch point, where you can collect data and other things on your donors. It's definitely a hub, but I would say that, again, back to how are donors interacting in the world in general. You know, we are moving to less this notion of website and digital and more sort of omni-channel. How is my experience with a not-for-profit consistent no matter where I interact with them? So that becomes a little bit of the brand challenge, I guess, combined with the digital transformation opportunity.
Yeah, and I know you're familiar, Mark, with a study published by Canada Helps, and I'd expect some of the results would be reflected in the United States. But was it and remind me here, is it 60% of nonprofits are not going to be taking on this digital transformation project? Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's the stat that came out. I think it was earlier this year. 60% of not-for-profits have no intention of digitally transforming. And again, that's back to because they don't have the resources. They're these smaller organizations that need to figure out different ways to do what they need to do. And part of that is, partnering. Part of that is potentially, some of those coming together and creating coalitions or new organizations. I think it was Paul Alofs, who's the ex-CEO of Princess Margaret Cancer Foundation, who coined the term last year around merge, purge, and surge. So really, not-for-profits going forward, fitting into one of those three categories. The ones that need to merge, they need to merge. The ones that might not make it, they will be purged, and then they'll be the ones that will be successful and surge. So, which it's not like, I guess it's not really a choice. Well, it's a choice if you want to take action, but it's not-for-profits will fit into one of those three.
Yeah, and I think, and I don't think, I am certain that a portion of this audience will be folks working at organizations that are not currently planning or mandated for digital innovation. But people are listening in because they want to figure out how to help. Most people don't enter the nonprofit space to not help. We want to help. And I think universally, if you're looking forward, digital innovation is a key part of your future. So if we have folks working in places that aren't planning for digital innovation and are interested in taking that first step and maybe trying to build some consensus, Mark, do you have any advice on how they can tackle that problem?
Yeah, my advice would be start somewhere. So again, we tend to wait until we've got the perfect plan, the perfect roadmap. Start somewhere. If there's something that is, again, low-hanging fruit, opportunity to start to create that first kind of case that you can then build upon, I would encourage you to start there, because it does become this ongoing sort of momentum building and actually a journey that's never done. So if you wait, you'll never start. So I would say start somewhere.
And if we're starting somewhere, we're gonna just create this hypothetical scenario that we're starting somewhere. Do we need to prepare leadership or our boards um, that we might fail with it? Or are we going all in on something so easy that we are going to see success?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. That comes back to the culture question around being willing to try things and have the appetite and the support that this might not succeed in the way that we expected, and that's okay. So I think definitely having board support and education at the board level around the importance of this. I think boards are slowly coming around as the organizations that they're overseeing absolutely have to make this move, right? The burning platform before the last couple of years was, why do we need to make any change, right? We've still got our major donors coming in or these programs. I think the burning platform is now everywhere. So boards need to look at this, and then senior management also needs to be aligned on where this needs to go. And it's really about also leaving a legacy for the organization, if you think about it, because some of this transformation work may continue well beyond some of the tenure of, be it board members or be it leadership teams for the future.
I'd say we're seeing at Wisely some of the larger nonprofits are coming to learn about what we do because their board has really mandated them to start building up their AI capabilities. And AI is only one portion of digital transformation. And I think that when we're looking at those larger organizations, they tend to have um, larger boards. There's going to be more experience from banks and insurance companies where they're doing a lot of this work. But in the more community focused nonprofits, I suspect that board representation of we'll call it digital business maybe less. Is that something that you've experienced?
I don't know that that's a general comment that I would say across the spectrum. I've worked with smaller organizations where it does come down to having key members on your board who are informed and know about the space and can push the organization to that space. But I've encountered that in smaller organizations. I've encountered that obviously in large organizations as well. So I wouldn't say it's an absolute statement. I think boards need to look at representation of among diversity and inclusion, also diversity of background when it comes to digital knowledge as well.
Should we start looking for an innovation task force within our boards, bringing it up to our boards of having, a director of innovation who's maybe pushing a little bit on the way things are done? I don't know, just an idea off the cuff there.
Well, and it's interesting you say that because ultimately there needs to be someone who's steering the ship and driving forward. In the long term, no one person or no one subcommittee or no one team owns innovation. But to get it moving, I think you need that person who is responsible for rallying, getting it moving, getting it going, and then start to distribute it more across the organization. Because again, it's not about, oh, that one team, they're focused on innovation. I don't need to think about it, right? In my role, that's a slippery slope too. But I think you're right that you need that initial impetus to move things forward. Otherwise, you just say to everyone, innovate, and it becomes, distributed chaos. So you need a focal point for sure.
Yeah, just an interesting idea, I think, as we talk through this. And I know I've seen a couple of very small questions about like how do we start. That might be a way to start building that buy-in top to bottom. And when you're allowed to fail, like I can tell you, I had a digital idea at one of the charities that I worked with, a hospital in large hospital in Toronto, and I spent a decent chunk of money and raised zero. And while it did represent a small piece of my budget, I was hoping to pilot it. When it rose, like when we literally raised $0, I was happy to announce that we did not have to do that again. And we kind of celebrated it in a way.
Well, and that's a great example. And I would say back to, how do you make this part of the culture? At Sick Kids Foundation, we did something called innovation rounds, building off of the rounds that happen at the hospital. And in those, intentionally, were case studies and examples that were successful, and also case studies and examples that failed. And one of the first ones that was presented as part of that round series was actually one of the VPs getting up and saying, this is what we did, or this is what I was responsible for, and here's how it failed. And that really sent a message, right? It just gives permission that, oh my goodness, okay, my VP is standing there and saying this. Beyond just saying you have permission, here is, walking the talk. And I think that's where, again, it comes back to all roads lead back to culture at the end of the day. But that's a good example of, a small thing that you could start in any organization. We didn't invent the idea of, doing lunch and learns and case studies like that, but starting to showcase where innovation exists already today. And I guarantee you, if you look at things you're doing in any organization, there are things that are being done that are moving the needle and looking at things differently. It's about how do you start to build some critical mass and momentum around that.
Yeah, I really love I love that concept a lot, Mark. And let's play it out for we got a couple of minutes here. So the simplest thing that someone could do to start building this culture of innovation that would allow for digital transformation is to do a lunch and learn for the team where you get to talk about your failures. And as you did it at Sick Kids, that was presented as rounds and you had people come up. I can tell you the startup community follows a very similar approach here in Toronto. They have F up nights, and founders and senior leaders tell people how they messed up, their messed up story. And with those failures also comes learning. And it also allows a little bit, at least, to start having the idea that it is okay to get it wrong. Uh, I have always believed a little bit that perfection is the enemy of progress. When you're trying to get everything done and have the perfect plan, you'll spend your lifetime planning and never executing.
Progress over perfection. Completely agree.
Yeah. So those little lunch and learns, which would be free for anyone listening to want to do that, they can. And of course, if you wanted to share this recording with anyone on your team or anyone that works with you, that would be available to you. So with that, we have about 10 minutes left. We got 8 minutes left. I did want to open the floor to questions. If you raise your hand, I'll put you on mic. You can ask your question, or you can put it into the Q&A. If you've got something about to ask Mark or myself, we're happy to oblige. And I'm going to wait awkwardly for a moment, encouraging anyone to ask us a question or raise their hand. Oh, Greg, thank you. So where does AI fit into the mix? And Mark, why don't you take that one? I talk about AI all the time.
Yeah, I see AI in the not-for-profit context as really an opportunity to use resources more wisely, be able to gather intelligence from the data. I mean, one of the most incredible resources that not-for-profits do have is data about their donors, data about the programs they're working on. How do you extract value from data? Using AI to do that, freeing up resources for other things you might be doing. So I think AI in the not-for-profit context, leading you to that next best thing you should be doing with your donor, whatever that might look like. There's tremendous opportunity from unlocking value of the data, but also freeing up some time to be focused on other things. Back to resource being a constraint for many not-for-profits.
We do have a question here from Maria. Do you have any case studies or resources regarding innovation in charitable fundraising? Maria, I can point you to our website. Actually, one of the folks listening in here, we did a case study with Troy from Kelowna's Gospel Mission. Troy, new to fundraising, who started using the Wisely software. So he didn't know fundraising. He didn't know Kelowna's Gospel Mission. In his first 90 days on the job, he had raised $70,000. I think he's well above 150 6 months in. So he achieved his targets. So you can find some good examples of case studies that are niche. Mark, perhaps you've encountered one where we're tackling maybe a larger digitization issue has produced some interesting results. Maybe nonprofit, maybe for-profit would be the easier way to find that.
Well, I mean, going back to my agency days, we actually, one of the programs we ran for Dove at the time, we actually came up with a concept where you would actually purchase product in store and redeem the product codes for, in this case, the campaign was Dove Sleepover. So you get Dove sleepover pants sent to you. And what we learned in creating that program and pushing the boundary at the time with Unilever was they'd actually never done a consumer facing e-commerce execution before anywhere globally. So we literally became, by virtue of that program, their very first e-commerce solution, believe it or not, because Unilever doesn't sell, or didn't sell at the time, direct to consumer. So unintended consequence, I guess, of pushing an innovation in another area led to innovation, in that case, in the e-commerce space for Unilever.
Fantastic. Well, we've got 4 minutes left. I think it's time to wrap up. First and foremost, thanks to our participants for joining us, and some good, actually very thought-provoking questions. Mark, your insight today was excellent for me to hear. I hope anyone listening in got as much as I did out of it. And I can say personally, even though we did actually talk before the webinar, believe it or not, I still got tons out of our conversation today. For anyone listening in, this will be available. If you registered, you will receive a link via email, and we do post all of these to our website. And lastly, we're going to be doing these every month. So tune in August. We're going to be talking about digital innovation again. Slightly different story, a new speaker. Follow us on social. Mark and I would love to connect with you. In the chat is a link to our LinkedIn. Both he and I are active there, and we'd love to hear from you. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Wes, and thanks for all the great questions.
Bye-bye, everybody.